Good morning everyone. In the last lecture we discussed in detail regarding cranial and spinal meninges. Okay. We end at subarachnoid cistern. Okay. So today we will discuss regarding subarachnoid cistern and our next point is CSF circulation. So these 2 points we will discuss, subarachnoid cistern and CSF circulation. Okay. So following are the points that you have to remember regarding subarachnoid cistern. So what is subarachnoid cistern? At some spaces around the brain, there is divergence between two layers of the dura mater, that is between the arachnoid mater and pia mater. At the point of the divergence at various places inside the brain, there is more space available for the subarachnoid space. So this large roomy space having plenty amount of CSF, that is known as subarachnoid cistern. Okay. So there are so many type of the cistern are present inside the CNS. Okay. Before we discuss regarding the subarachnoid cistern, we need to orientation about the various part of the CNS. Okay. So in this diagram, most superiorly placed, this part is known as large brain, that is the cerebral hemisphere. Okay. This is the connecting portion of the two cerebral hemisphere, that is known as corpus callosum. Okay. This is the part of the midbrain. This is our pituitary gland. This is pons, medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata is known as brainstem, and this caudal portion is known as spinal cord. This is our cerebellum. Okay. Again we repeat, this is the cerebral hemisphere, corpus callosum, that is the connecting neurological structure between the two lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, then part of the brainstem, midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. Okay, these three collectively is known as brainstem. This is the spinal cord. This is the cerebellum, that is the cerebellar hemisphere. This is the pituitary gland. Okay. In addition to this, some space is available inside the CNS, particularly within the brain, that is known as ventricle. This ventricle is different from the ventricle of the heart. Okay. So these are the ventricles. Okay, this space is known as ventricle. Okay, so there are three type of the major ventricle available inside the CNS. Lateral ventricle inside the cerebral hemisphere. Lateral ventricle, that is the cavity inside the cerebral hemisphere. Then third ventricle, that is the cavity in between the part of the diencephalon. Practically speaking, it is the space between the two thalamus. Fourth ventricle, it is the space between the cerebellum posteriorly and pons and medulla oblongata anteriorly. Okay, that is known as fourth ventricle. In addition to that, there is central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, that lies within the spinal cord. Okay. Now we discuss regarding the subarachnoid cistern. So which are the major cistern? So first one, cerebellomedullary cistern or cisterna magna. Magna means large. Cerebellomedullary cistern. So obviously the name itself suggests cerebellomedullary cistern lies between the inferior surface of the cerebellum and dorsal surface of the medulla oblongata. Okay. So this triangular space between the inferior surface of the cerebellum, dorsal surface of medulla oblongata, and here locates the internal occipital crest. So this triangular zone is known as cerebellomedullary cistern. Okay, or cisterna magna. That is the one. Then cisterna ambiens. Okay, so what is cisterna ambiens? It is the cistern which lies between the splenium of the corpus callosum superiorly, superior surface of the cerebellum inferiorly, and posterior part of the posterior part of the tectum of the midbrain. Okay, so this part is known as cisterna ambiens, cisterna ambiens, cisterna ambiens, or it is containing great cerebral vein. Okay, it is containing great cerebral vein. This is known as cisterna ambiens. Third one, cisterna pontis. Name itself suggests this cistern is in relation with the pons, particularly anterior surface of the pons. This is the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. These are their dorsal surface, these are the ventral surface. So, cisterna pontis lies in relation with the ventral surface of the pons. Okay, that is the 3. Then, interpeduncular cistern. Interpeduncular is the area which lies on the base of the brain. Okay, so this cistern is in relation with the interpeduncular area of the brain. Okay, the major structure in the interpeduncular cistern is pituitary gland. Okay, and the last one that we have already discussed, that is the lumbar cistern. Okay, name itself suggests it lies in the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Okay, this large space of the spinal subarachnoid space lies in relation with the spinal cord, and this cistern extends between the conus medullaris to the S2, that is the second sacral vertebrae. Okay, this is known as lumbar cistern, that is typically used for the lumbar puncture, for the collection of the CSF for the various diagnostic purpose. Okay, so this is all about the cistern. So one point you keep in your mind, cistern is nothing but it is the larger subarachnoid space in relation to the different part of the brain. Okay, cerebellomedullary cistern in relation to the in between the cerebellum and medulla oblongata, cisterna ambiens in between the splenium of the corpus callosum and cerebellum, cisterna pontis in relation to the ventral surface of the pons, and interpendicular cistern in relation to the base of the brain. Okay, and lumbar cistern in relation to the lumbar region of the subarachnoid space, that is the lumbar cistern. Okay, our next point is cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, popularly known as cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so following are the points: introduction, then various composition, how it forms, formation, circulation, different part of the CNS, absorption, its function, and some part regarding clinical anatomy or applied anatomy, whatever you term. Okay. So what is CSF? CSF, here in the diagram it is shown with this light pink color. Okay. Various part of the CNS, particularly ventricle and all these systems are filled with CSF. Okay. So CSF is known as cerebrospinal fluid. It is clear colorless, water like fluid. Composition is almost similar to the blood plasma or interstitial or extracellular fluid. Okay. CSF is mainly derived from the blood. Okay. CSF is mainly derived from the blood, and the CSF mainly lies in the various part of the ventricle. For example, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle. In addition to that, it also lies in the various subarachnoid system. Okay. So what is the function of the CSF? The main function of the CSF is to provide the protection to the brain. It acts as the shock absorber. It acts as a hydraulic shock absorber. As we can see in the diagram, as the CSF lies all over the various part of the brain and spinal cord, so it provides the floatiness to the brain and spinal cord. So actually what happens, the weight of the brain and spinal cord is approximately 1.3 to 1.5 kg, but because of the CSF, as it provides floatiness, because of that the brain and spinal cord ultimately becomes lighter in weight, and the weight is reduced to the approximately 50 grams. Okay. And thereby it provides the hydraulic shock absorber function. Okay. Not only it provides the protection, it provides the floatiness to the brain and spinal cord. So we can say the brain and spinal cord floats, it swims inside the CSF. Here the CSF is shown with the light pink color. as we can see in the diagram, it lies mainly in the ventricle as well as various part of the cistern. Okay. So it baths the various part of the cerebral hemisphere, other part of the brainstem and spinal cord. Okay. Now what is the composition? Our next point. CSF is mainly clear colorless fluid. Okay. If we talk about the various chemical composition, it has got various ion, for example sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate. In addition to that, it has got protein and glucose. Here you should note that protein and glucose level is less than the blood level, while sodium, chloride level and bicarbonate level they are more in amount as compared to blood. Okay. Detail you will learn definitely in physiology. Okay. Our next point, that is the formation of the CSF. How the CSF is formed? Okay. CSF is mainly formed from the ventricles. So which are the ventricles in our body? Three main ventricles. Lateral ventricle, it is the cavity inside the cerebral hemisphere. Third ventricle, it is the cavity in the diencephalon, that is the thalamus. And fourth ventricle, it is the cavity inside the rhombencephalon, that is between the pons and medulla oblongata anteriorly and cerebellum posteriorly. These three ventricle and its lining gives formation of the CSF. Okay. So ventricle is what? It is the cavity inside the CNS. Okay. Here we understand in the simplified diagram. Okay. This is the diagram showing the ventricle. Okay. So we take orientation about this diagram. This is the dura mater. Below the dura mater, arachnoid mater, that is shown with the pink color. This is the subarachnoid space. Below the subarachnoid space, pia mater. Then comes the tissue of the brain. Okay. So there are two type of matter inside the CNS. Gray matter is the outer one and white matter inner one. Okay. So which are the main cell of the white matter or CNS? Obviously neuron, that is the basic cell, and supporting cell is the astrocytes. Okay. And inside the white matter there is the cavity, and that cavity is known as ventricle. Okay. So this is the schematic diagram showing the ventricular cavity. Okay. So cavity of the ventricle is lined by two type of the cell, ependymal cell, and in the floor of the ventricular cavity there is choroidal epithelial cell. That is nothing but it is the modification of the ependymal cell. Okay. Ependymal cell or ependymocyte, and this is the modified ependymocyte which is known as choroidal epithelial cell. Okay. And ventricular cavity has also got invagination of the double layered fold of the pia mater and blood vessel. That blood vessel is known as choroidal blood vessel. Okay. So there are three structure as far as the production of the CSF is concerned. The innermost which lines the ventricular cavity, that is known as choroidal epithelial cell, then double layer fold of the pia mater and choroidal blood vessel. Okay, which is the branch of, indirectly branch of the internal carotid artery. So 1, 2 and 3. This 3 is collectively known as choroidal plexus. So there are basically 3 choroidal plexus as per the name of the ventricle: choroidal plexus of lateral ventricle, choroidal plexus of the third ventricle, choroidal plexus of the fourth ventricle. Okay. Now what is telachoroidea? Telachoroidea is equal to choroidal epithelial cell plus pia mater. Choroidal epithelial cell plus pia mater is known as telachoroidea. Okay. If you add the choroidal blood vessel in these two structures, then it is collectively known as choroidal plexus. Okay. Then our point is how CSF is formed. CSF is formed from this blood CSF barrier. Okay. Blood circulate around the ventricular cavity. Okay. And from this blood, this choroidal epithelial cell choroidal epithelial cell filter and secretes the CSF inside the ventricular cavity. Okay, this is the process. Okay, in between the choroidal epithelial cell, as we can see, there is a tight junction. So it will allow only the fluid like material inside the ventricular cavity from the blood. It does not allow the transport of the protein and other large macromolecules. Okay, so that is the function of the choroidal epithelial cell. Okay, this is how the CSF is formed. Okay, choroidal epithelial cell invaginates or lines the ventricular cavity, then lies the pia mater, and outside the pia mater there lies the choroidal blood vessel. Okay, so from this blood vessel, this choroidal epithelial cell will derives the fluid like material, and it will allow the passage of that fluid like material inside the ventricular cavity. This is how the CSF is formed. Once this CSF is formed, it will transport at various places surrounding the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so we start from here. You follow this green arrow, as you can see, you follow the direction of this green arrow. This is how CSF circulates around the various part of the brain. Okay, so what is this structure? This is known as lateral ventricle. As we have seen in this diagram, any ventricular cavity will have these three basic structure. Okay, and thereby it will allow the formation of the CSF. Once the CSF is formed from the lateral ventricle, it will passes through the one foramen in the lateral ventricle, that is known as interventricular foramen of Monro. From the interventricular foramen Monro, it will go inside the diencephalon. Again there is one cavity is there, that is known as third ventricle. Third ventricle also contributes formation of CSF. Collectively all these CSFs enter inside the fourth ventricle. What is the fourth ventricle? It is the space between the pons and medulla oblongata anteriorly and cerebellum posteriorly. Okay, so this CSF now passes through the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, this CSF will passes through the one foramen, that is known as foramen Meninges and foramen Lusca. Okay, and enters inside the cerebellomedullary cistern or cisterna magna. Okay, from the cisterna magna, there are two pathways that diverge. From the cisterna magna, this CSF circle around the brainstem and ascend, or it will pass down inferiorly towards the spinal cord. Okay. Once it enters into the spinal subarachnoid space, it reaches the lumbar cistern, it completely bathes the spinal cord, and then again CSF ascend and goes towards the cisterna pontis. Okay, and some CSF enters inside the central canal of the spinal cord, and thereby it provides the nutrition to the tissue of the spinal cord. Okay, after reaching in the area of the cisterna pontis, it passes around the base of the brain, that is in the region of the interpendicular cistern. Then it passes around the inferior surface of the cerebrum, it passes around the supralateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, as we know that on the superior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere there is superior sagittal sinus, as we have seen in this diagram. Okay, this is the superior surface of the cerebrum. Okay, this is the skull vault. Okay, so in this area between the endosteal and meningeal layer of the dura mater, there is the superior sagittal sinus that we have already learned in the head and neck. Okay, so once the CSF enters, where it enters? In the region of the supralateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, it enters inside the superior sagittal sinus. How it enters in the superior sagittal sinus? With the help of the arachnoid villi and granulation. Okay, this is how CSF is absorbed inside the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, already we have discussed how the CSF is absorbed inside the dural venous sinus with the help of the arachnoid villi and granulation. Okay, so that is the course or rotation of the CSF occurs around the various part of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, again we revise. Formation of the CSF occurs at three places: lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle. How it is formed? With the help of the specialized cell, that is the choroidal epithelial cell, as well as pia mater and choroidal blood vessel. Choroidal epithelial cell derived the CSF with the help of the dialysis or filtration. It will allow the passage of CSF inside the ventricular cavity. Once the CSF enters inside the ventricular cavity at the three places, lateral, third and fourth ventricle, it passes through the cerebellomedullary cistern. Then some CSF passes descend around the spinal subarachnoid space, that is the lumbar cistern, and majority of the CSF wind around the, it flow around the dorsal to anterior aspect of the brainstem, and it enters inside the cisterna pontis. Then it passes through the interpedicular cistern, that is the base of the brain. Then it passes around the supralateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The purpose here is to nourish the each and every aspect of the brain, okay, thoroughly, and then ultimately this subarachnoid space open inside the dural venous sinus, the major dural venous sinus, that is known as superior sagittal sinus. How this CSF is drained inside the dural venous sinus? That we have already done with the help of the arachnoid villi and granulation. Okay, this is how CSF is formed, circulate and absorb inside the superior sagittal sinus. Okay. Our next point is function. So already we have discussed the main function of the CSF is to provide the protection to the brain and spinal cord. It provides the hydraulic shock absorber like function. Okay. It provides the metabolism, it provides the nutrition to the brain and related tissue. It absorbs the harmful substance, waste metabolites from the brain and related tissue. Okay. So that is the function of the CSF. Now last point, applied anatomy. So applied anatomy, in one word, the main applied aspect is the hydrocapilas. What is the hydrocapilas? Hydrocapilas is the condition in which the maximum amount of CSF is collected inside the subarachnoid space. As we have seen, the CSF passes through the various places of the brain. Okay. If any of these places is obstructed by any tumor or due to infection or maybe due to congenital causes, obviously the CSF will not be able to pass forward and will not be able to absorb inside the superior sagittal sinus, and because of that CSF will be collected inside the ventricular cavity or around the subarachnoid space. As the CSF get collected inside the ventricular cavity or around the subarachnoid space, there will be dilatation of the ventricular cavity, and because of that what happen, it will compress the surrounding structure obviously. So it will give rise to various signs and symptoms. Okay. And this condition is known as hydrocapilas. Okay. And particularly children are more prone to affection. Okay. So which are the signs of hydrocapilas? Skull become enlarged in size. You know the suture become separated, okay, because of the raised intracranial pressure. Okay. Suture becomes separated and there is delayed closure of the suture. Okay. Then what happens? There is dilatation of the scalp veins, because this sagittal sinus which receives the epiploic and diploic vein, extracranial veins, will not be able to drain inside it because of the raised intracranial pressure. So there will be dilated scalp veins. Okay. And there will be thinning of the skull bones because of the raised intracranial pressure. Typical appearance, the sunset eye like appearance, eye become dropped down. Okay. And there will be delayed milestone of the child. Okay. There will be palsy of the various cranial nerves, loss of motor function, dementia, loss of memories. Okay, ultimately the child become in a morbid state. Okay, so all these are the sign and symptom of the this hydrocephalus. Okay. Our next point is choroid plexus and brain barriers. So already we have discussed what is choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is nothing but it is the made up of three structure: choroidal epithelial cell, double layer fold of the pyometer, and blood vessel. These three is equal to choroid plexus. It help in the formation of the secretion of the CSF. Now three brain barriers are there. Blood brain barriers, it is the barrier between brain and blood. Okay, blood is inside the blood vessel. Okay, so there are five structure between the blood brain barrier. First one is the neuron, second is the intercellular space, third is the astrocyte, fourth one is the endothelial lining of the blood vessel, fifth one is the basement membrane. This is known as blood brain barrier. What is the function of blood brain barrier? It will prevent the passage of the harmful substance from the blood inside the brain. Second, brain CSF barrier, that is the barrier between the brain and CSF. Okay, so the main barrier between these two is the processes of the neuron and intercellular space and ependymocyte, that is the brain CSF barrier. Okay. Third one is the blood CSF barrier, that is we have already learned, it is the barrier between the choroidal blood vessel and choroidal epithelial cell, that is known as blood CSF barrier. Okay. So here we finish. Thank you very much.